It hasn't been a good year for the gaming industry. A lot of games have failed, a lot of developers have been laid off, and discontent amongst consumers seems to be at record highs. If you spend much time online, you've probably seen some variation of the phrase, "gaming is dying." I know I have, but here's the thing. I've seen variations of this phrase being thrown around for many years, during which I also saw gaming grow faster and more consistently than any other major media industry. For years, as people were declaring gaming dead, gaming was actually booming. But it's not booming anymore. In fact, across multiple metrics, the gaming industry has seen its first genuine period of sustained decline in over 40 years, and I now think it might be easy to underestimate the severity of the problem. It's a bit like the story of the boy who cried wolf. People spent so many years complaining about modern gaming and predicting imminent gaming crashes that it became easy to overlook the actual warning signs when they did appear. For example, when 2021 and 2022 produced disappointing numbers, most were quick to jump to COVID as the explanation, referring to interrupted development schedules and post-lockdown pullbacks to explain the industry's stumble. But as one bad year eventually turned into 4 in a row, this explanation stopped seeming sufficient. Meanwhile, when record numbers of developers started being laid off, everyone was quick to blame greedy corporations and CEOs, claiming that job cuts were unnecessary while making comparisons to big tech giants sacrificing workers in their never-ending quest for rising stock prices. There was one important difference between those big tech companies and gaming ones, however, which is that for big tech, stock prices did indeed rise. Whereas for the gaming industry, they mostly just went down. Still, layoffs and stock prices are only scratching the surface. The industry is in trouble, and by this point, the writing is on the wall. So, what exactly is going on? That is the question this video is looking at. This subject has been covered a lot already, but I've found it disappointing and sometimes even misleading how shallow a lot of that coverage can be. So instead, I decided to investigate the situation for myself to try and go a little deeper. So, is gaming dying? Well, not exactly, but the situation doesn't look good. Video games were an economic miracle. The gaming industry came out of nowhere and rode the wave of technological advances year after year, blowing away economic forecasts and becoming the biggest entertainment industry in the world, by a wide margin. Today, the gaming industry isn't just larger than the movie and music industries combined, its market value is almost triple their combined size. For years, the numbers all just went up, until something unexpected happened. The rate of growth increased. The 2010s saw consumer spending on video games grow at twice its historical average and 3.4 times the rate of world GDP. In a time when people might have expected the industry to finally mature, with growth slowing down, the industry instead grew faster than ever, making everyone optimistic for the future. Video games were an economic miracle. Or maybe miracles aren't real. The video game industry did show incredible growth, but this wasn't the result of business as usual, and it could never continue forever. The 2010s were a boom created by a number of specific circumstances, like mobile gaming. Mobile games grew rapidly alongside smartphone growth and allowed penetration into new markets of casual and global audiences. But then, smartphone adoption slowed, because everyone already had smartphones, and mobile gaming growth slowed alongside it, before taking a further beating from increased competition from new social video platforms like TikTok. A similar story can be seen with other growth factors. Microtransactions, free-to-play models, online gaming, and live service games all brought about new revenue sources and greater player engagement and retention, until live service growth slowed because so many people were already playing them, and further monetization methods were taking as far as consumer pushback would allow, and so couldn't be taken any further. Gaming demographics also expanded as the game-playing children of the 80s and 90s grew up and often kept playing games, all while new generations continued to pick up controllers, expanding the gaming player base until video games had shed their reputation of being just for kids entirely and demographic expansion slowed down. Meanwhile, the rise of social media brought a rise of social media gaming content while aiding things like game discoverability, and digital distribution platforms like Steam lowered production and distribution costs while lowering the barrier to buy games. So basically, in the 2010s, gaming cashed in on the rise of smartphones, the internet, demographic expansion, globalization, and good old corporate greed, allowing the gaming market to expand until it had few places left to expand into. Growth has limits. In order to go beyond those limits, new growth factors would need to be found, and perhaps knowing this, the industry has tried to find them. VR, cloud gaming, subscription services, Web3, AI, new ideas were found and seeds were planted. But this time, they didn't bear much fruit. VR has shown plenty of technical improvements, but its install base has remained small, with growth far below forecasts. Cloud gaming still has no hype, with Google Stadia's complete failure leaving a dark cloud over its future. Subscription models like Xbox Game Pass have pulled in an impressive amount of users, but this has come at high costs, alongside slowing adoption rates, and the long-term sustainability of such models remains unclear. Web3 gaming seems like a complete clusterfuck, but to be fair, it's an area I've largely stayed away from, and people are still out there proselytizing it, so maybe it will pick up any day now. Just like maybe NFT prices will bounce back, and grandma will finally look down from up high and thank you for spending all your inheritance on some worthless JPEGs. And as for the AI gaming revolution, if there is one right around the corner, it's sneaking up on us quietly, alongside a lot of consumer and developer pessimism. In reality, the future is hard to predict, and the current situation could change rapidly. So it's impossible to say what's really in store for video games, but there is one problem most of these new potential growth factors have. In the 2010s, gaming saw record growth because it expanded into new markets. Meanwhile, most emerging technologies today aren't focused on unlocking new markets. Instead, they're based around cannibalizing existing ones. Cloud gaming could lower the barrier for entry into high-end gaming while allowing developers to further push modern technology to its limits. But widespread adoption of cloud gaming would mean consumers no longer regularly buying expensive gaming consoles or graphics cards, lowering hardware spending. Meanwhile, subscription services can provide great value for money, but they also replace the need to buy individual games, lowering software spending. And so, after 40 years, the era of easy growth seemed to finally come to an end. So, what happened next, and how are things going in the 2020s? I think I should probably take a moment to thank entrepreneur, advisor, and inter/national best-selling author Matthew Ball, because a lot of the data I'm using in this video is coming from him, in particular his presentation on the state of video gaming in 2025, which is available online for free. This presentation collects data from a wide range of sources and features a lot of illustrative graphs, which are quite helpful. Still, even with helpful graphs, it's worth being aware that numbers can be confusing. One important concept to keep in mind is that just because numbers go up doesn't mean a company or industry is doing well. For example, if a stock performs worse than the market average, this can be a bad sign, even though the stock price might seem to be increasing. So when you look at something like this graph, which shows the performance of many major gaming stocks over the last 4 years, you might look at it and think, well, at least Capcom is doing well by being up 36%. However, this is a period where stocks, and particularly tech stocks, have performed well. And so even Capcom is still performing far below the S&P 500 for this period, with most other gaming stocks performing considerably worse. Likewise, small increases in things like revenue or consumer spending might still be less than inflation. For example, looking at worldwide consumer spending on games shows a rather flat line that is well behind most forecasts, and that might seem okay because the line is flat, so at least the industry isn't shrinking. Except this doesn't account for inflation, which recent years brought plenty of, so this flat line means the industry has technically shrunk 13% in this period. And this is the same period where world GDP is up 11%, making the actual decline even greater. A comparison to other media industries paints an even worse picture, because every other industry has grown. Well, almost every industry industry. Newspapers also shrunk, but being alongside newspapers probably isn't where gaming wants to be. Still, at least newspapers were expected to decline and would have budgeted accordingly. Gaming, on the other hand, saw its best decade in history, with growth accelerating towards the end of the decade and venture capital investments pouring in at a higher rate than ever before. And even if you weren't making much money in this period, record low interest rates ensured borrowing money had never been cheaper. So, what do businesses do with record profit, record investments, and easy access to cheap debt? They spend. They reinvest, they expand, they grow, they greenlight new games, and they hire more staff. There is logic behind this beyond greed. Business is a never-ending competition, so companies who aren't reinvesting profits are always at risk of falling behind. And perhaps even more importantly, reinvesting money is the best way to pay less tax on that money. The tax system basically incentivizes continuous reinvestment of profits to incentivize a continuous quest for growth. And so, when gaming was booming, no one questioned the hiring spree this led to. But as the new decade got underway and the boom turned to bust, record hiring was replaced with something else. The gaming industry is no stranger to layoffs, but in 2022, it would hit a new all-time record of 7,949 job cuts for the year. This doesn't include unannounced layoffs, or layoffs that don't disclose actual numbers, which were around 1/3 of all announcements, so the real number is likely much higher. Anyway, this all-time record didn't last long because it was beaten in 2023 with 8,706 confirmed job losses, before being beaten again in 2024 with 16,766. For comparison, the number from 2021 was 567, making 2024 an increase of 2,857%. The gaming industry is no stranger to layoffs, but it's never seen layoffs like this before. A recent survey from GDC revealed 11% of developers reported being laid off in recent years, with 41% reporting being impacted by layoffs. Many hope these layoffs will slow down in 2025 and that the worst is already over. It remains to be seen whether this is actually true. Still, there's more to the layoff situation than meets the eye. In case you didn't know, video games are expensive, and they've only become more expensive over time. In 2009, Naughty Dog's gaming blockbuster Uncharted 2 cost $20 million. 10 years later, The Last of Us Part 2 cost $220 million. Meanwhile, 2015's Call of Duty Black Ops 3 cost over $450 million, and by 2020, Black Ops Cold War would rise to $700 million. A number that is, by the way, higher than the most expensive movie ever made by some margin. Games are costly, and most of their cost is labor. In a recent Bloomberg article, Jason Schreier estimated an average game developer in LA costs between $15,000 and $20,000 a month, meaning the cost of 100 developers is $18 to $24 million per year. Now, games usually take much longer than 1 year, and AAA games take much more than 100 developers. So, you can do the math if you want. And so, when gaming companies want to save money, they cut jobs, because that is where most of the money's spent. Still, there is another way to lower labor costs. LA has some of the highest average salaries in the world, but what if you could use game developers from low-wage areas? Have you ever watched the credits for any recent AAA game? I don't blame you if you haven't, because these days they just drag on and on and on. And that's because modern gaming has massive amounts of outsourcing. Outsourcing has grown significantly over the last 20 years, and today it's difficult to find any major release that doesn't have a double-digit number of external studios listed in its credits. And this includes highly acclaimed games like Elden Ring, as well as independently published games like Baldur's Gate 3. Everyone is doing this. Outsourcing can allow specialized studios to be brought in for specialized work, like audio and visual effects or 3D modeling, and can allow more scalability and flexibility to meet the changing demands of development. For example, by bringing in lots of QA staff towards the very end of development. Mostly though, outsourcing is a way to lower labor costs, as much of the outsourcing industry exists in lower wage areas like India, Southeast Asia, or South America. So, as gaming revenue slows and development costs keep going up, outsourcing becomes more and more attractive, further incentivizing cutting staff numbers in higher wage areas. And yet, for Western developers, the problems don't end here. If we look at where the gaming industry did actually manage to grow in recent years, you'll notice that PC gaming has outperformed everything else. Now, you might assume that's because PC gaming is the best gaming, PC Master Race, all hail Lord Gaben, and so on. Still, a more likely explanation is that PC gaming is one of the few areas that still has room to grow thanks to certain key emerging markets, like China. China has a large population, and in just the last couple years, Chinese has grown rapidly to overtake English as the most popular language on Steam. Unlike in the West, the Chinese market is still growing, and in theory, that should be a good thing. More video game players means more sales and more profits. Except, there's a problem. Chinese gamers play Chinese games. And so, as the Chinese market grows, all of the new profit is coming from games developed in China. In general, foreign markets seem to show a strong preference for products made in their own country. This can be observed in other markets, like Japan and Korea, and in other industries like movies. So this seems like the norm, except in the West. Western consumers seem to have much less of a preference for domestic products. And so, while Western games are failing to grow even in the few growing markets, non-Western games are still managing to grow in Western markets. For consumers, this isn't really a problem, But for Western developers, it means competition is still increasing, even though market size is stagnating, all while foreign developers are able to operate at much lower development costs due to their much lower wages. The gaming industry is not dying. Personally, I wouldn't even say it's in crisis. A lot of what's happening is understandable. Record growth over the 2010s led to an overly optimistic outlook and the start of a bubble. And now, instead of continuing to grow and grow until the bubble bursts and the industry genuinely crashes as it did in the 80s, the bubble is instead deflating a bit, which some might even argue is healthy. But that isn't the full picture. The global gaming industry might not be in crisis, but nearly all of the problems, the layoffs, the cancelled games, the falling stock prices, the high-profile failures, and the angry consumers are concentrated in the West. So, global gaming may not be in crisis, but the Western games industry might be. And if it isn't, it sure looks like it's heading in that direction. So, hopefully, this has provided a decent overview of the current situation. There is a lot more that can be said about this, and quite a bit more that I intend to say, but you could stop watching here if you want to. I've tried to make this section function as a satisfactory standalone that's about as in-depth as the average game player probably wants. If you do want to know more though, you can stick around as we go deeper. Just be warned that some parts might get a little political from here on. Now, the explanation I've just provided explains a lot about what's happening in gaming recently. Yet, when most people talk about this subject, almost nothing I've just covered is even acknowledged. Instead, most explanations for gaming's decline focus on 3 different narratives that each claim to explain who or what is really to blame. So, I think it's worth looking at each of these narratives to see if there's more to this situation than industry trends and macroeconomics. Starting with everyone's favorite. No one likes corporations. And there are good reasons for that. But this also means no one wants to defend corporations, and so people blame them for anything and everything. Often, corporations deserve blame, but this still creates a risk of oversimplifying complex problems, which I think is what usually happens in gaming as soon as the word corporation is invoked. Apparently, corporations are all incompetent, or at least the people running them are, or it's that they allowed business people to take charge instead of people who know gaming, or everything they do is out of a desire to make stock prices go up and this causes every other problem, or they're just really greedy. And there's some truth to all of these, which is why people say them, but none of these are new. The gaming industry grew for many years, and then suddenly stopped growing. So something changed recently, and it's not the sudden arrival of corporations. Corporations have always been here, and they've always been running the show. Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft were all big successful businesses before they had anything to do with video games. Meanwhile, Atari co-founder and father of games, Nolan Bushnell, was a businessman, not a gamer. He wasn't directly involved in making any of Atari's successful games, and the other thing he's famous for is founding Chuck E. Cheese. The suits have been here from the start, and while there are a few areas and eras that were less corporate, like PC gaming in the 80s, these are the exception, not the norm. At the very least, we can say that from the mid-90s onwards, gaming has been completely dominated by corporations. And yet, there were still good games and growth. The same is true for greed and the desire to see rising stock prices. Greed was not only just discovered in the year 2021, and businesses have always wanted to make a profit. And this is understandable, because profit isn't just a way to make the rich richer, it's also what provides job security, and creative freedom and many other benefits. So businesses want as much profit as possible, and that can make them greedy. But they have to be careful. Too much greed can cause profits to go down, as has been helpfully illustrated recently by Ubisoft. With the success of Assassin's Creed and Far Cry and their winning open world formula, Ubisoft were onto a good thing. And so, they milked their golden cows as much as they could, turning Assassin's Creed into an almost yearly franchise, creating as many other similar open world games as possible, jumping on whatever the latest industry trend was with unsuccessful looter shooters and battle royales, and worst of all, heavily pushing microtransactions, including in single-player games, something even other publishers rarely dared to. And guess what? This worked. Until it didn't. Greed brings in money at the cost of sustainability. Ubisoft maximized short-term profit and tanked their chances of long-term success in the process. But they didn't mean for this to happen. They simply did what they thought they could get away with. They made a calculated gamble, and they got it wrong. So the moral of the story is greed never pays. Sorry, that was a joke. Obviously, greed pays. That's the only reason people are greedy. You just can't take it too far. Never go full Ubisoft. But what happens if you do the opposite? Well, how many game studios have closed down because they didn't make enough money? How many games have been cancelled because the funds ran out, with years of hard work thrown away, never to be seen? When a publisher is involved in these situations, we just blame the publisher. But a publisher isn't always involved. Independent studios close. Independent games fail. Someone is out there right now making the indie game of their dreams and ignoring the business realities of the market. And when that game is finished, and it doesn't sell anywhere near as much as they hoped, they won't have the funds to continue, and their dream will come to an end. If that happens to you, by the way, don't feel too bad. It's because you're an artist, and at least you're in good company. But just as there is a price to being too greedy, there is a price to being not greedy enough. I wish there wasn't, but this is how the world works. Profit matters. Yet nobody seems to want to admit this. It's easier to just blame corporations and pretend that without them, all other problems fade away. The thing is, this theory has been tested. We've tried removing corporations, and we've seen what happens without them. After all, the two main things people mean when they say corporations in the context of gaming is publishers and private investors. And in the 2010s, crowdfunding emerged specifically as a way to bypass these corporate entities to allow players to fund games directly and empower developers to make the games they most wanted to make. And this did result in some great games, and some bad games, and some scams, but overall, it wasn't a disaster. And yet, it didn't revolutionize the industry, and most of the biggest original successes, like Double Fine, Obsidian Entertainment, and In Exile, saw their success dwindle with worse performing follow-ups before each ultimately accepted an offer to be consumed by the biggest gaming corporation of them all. Still, while we're talking about Kickstarter, it seems only fair to bring up a counterexample. Larian Studios also found success in the Kickstarter era, and unlike most, Larian followed this up with an even better performing sequel. Then, a few years later, Larian released Baldur's Gate 3, and everyone who cares about games has been filleting them for this ever since, including me. Baldur's Gate 3 wasn't just held up as a great game, It was held up as the gaming ideal, something the entire industry should learn from. A self-published title with no microtransactions from an independent studio with a likable and caring CEO. Hooray for Baldur's Gate 3, everything a game should be. And that's not sarcasm, I love this game and I love what it represents, but I do have a question. Would Baldur's Gate 3 have happened without corporate involvement? Because Divinity Original Sin 2 was a hugely successful game, and yet Larian still made the decision afterwards to sell a 30% share of their company to Tencent, one of the biggest corporations in the world. It's my understanding that funding via loans had caused Larian to go almost bankrupt in the past, and so for their next title, they instead did a pro-gamer or pro-capitalist move of selling a minority stake in the company, which worked. Baldur's Gate 3 is proof. The corporations bad narrative also usually stresses how corporations are never satisfied with small successes and instead always push to turn these into big successes, which is widely seen as bad and being just about greed. But this is also what Larian did. After the success of Divinity Original Sin 1, they aggressively hired and expanded to triple their size. Their next game, Original Sin 2, was even more successful, and then they aggressively expanded again. And even though Baldur's Gate 3 was about as successful as a game can be, meaning you might expect them to just keep everything the same now, they're not. They're still expanding, opening new studios and still growing. And maybe that is the best thing to do. It's not like I know. No one can predict the future. Reality is complicated and things are rarely black and white. But it's not enough to just say avoid corporations or ignore growth or just don't be greedy. Because there are countless examples of developers doing all these things who still fail. And many of the most successful games do none of these. By all means, blame corporations when they are to blame. There are many examples where that is the case. But we shouldn't pretend that explains everything or that the solution is self-evident. It's not. People just like to repeat narratives that tell them what they want to hear. Speaking of which, this is a sensitive subject, and I understand that most people don't really like it when non-political YouTubers talk about overtly political topics. But if you play games, it's getting harder and harder to ignore this particular subject. Now, given how often wokeness is discussed online, I do think it's reasonable for people to question what role it's played in Western gaming's downfall. People obviously have different tastes and beliefs, so the things people see as woke, like certain female leads, diversity, and LGBT representation, are going to be more appealing to some players than others. Ultimately, developers should be free to make whatever game they want to make, and supply and demand can take care of the rest. That said, today it does seem like there is a greater supply of woke games than there is demand. And this, combined with the fact that people who do dislike these features often strongly dislike them, is probably creating lower sales for certain woke games. If we go back 10 years ago, however, I don't think this was true, and it's easy to find games that might have benefited from their woke qualities. For example, many people consider Overwatch's very diverse cast of characters to be one of the things that made it such a success. Meanwhile, Undertale's several gay characters and gender-neutral protagonist who has they-them pronouns is surely part of what made that game so insanely popular with the Tumblr crowd, which clearly helped push it further into the mainstream. and I don't think Gone Home would have generated anywhere near as much attention if its story wasn't gay. When supply is low, woke or progressive elements might boost sales. But supply is not low anymore. Still, to blame wokeness for every problem in modern gaming is a vast simplification that seems obviously politically motivated. Games are attacked for being woke long before they come out, as Assassin's Creed Shadows, Avowed, and Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 have all recently shown. So clearly, this is not about execution or quality, because the controversies always start before anyone has actually played the games. A woke game failing also doesn't prove that much, because right now, so many games are failing that this is virtually the norm. There are also woke games that are very successful, like Baldur's Gate 3, a game with trans characters, drag queens, gay main story scenes, and detailed gender-neutral character creation options. I'm sure progressive elements are a deal-breaker for some players, but I imagine most people just want to play good games and don't care that deeply about anything else. So, while I do think wokeness is a factor, it's just one of many and has likely played less of a role than many of the broader economic trends I outlined earlier. For YouTubers who base their entire channel around the culture war, however, they can't admit this because their objective is to generate outrage. That is how they make money, meaning they have a financial incentive to exaggerate the role of wokeness and make game discussions as political and divisive as possible. And I think this is probably having a negative impact, making everyone understand what's actually happening less, while making people more hateful and divided in the process. But just as game developers are free to make woke games, YouTubers are free to make outrage-based content. It's still a question of supply and demand, and there's always demand for outrage on the internet. Still, in time, corporations will probably try to distance themselves from elements perceived as woke, because the industry is desperate to appeal to as many people as possible, and alienating parts of the audience for big-budget games goes against this. This might also explain why diversity was so quick to be embraced to begin with. Appealing to a diverse, and therefore larger player base probably sounded quite good once upon a time for an industry that needed to find new audiences to stay growing. There are also lots of progressive developers in the industry, so it makes sense that this would lead to lots of progressive games. None of this is due to conspiracy. But I do think there will be an industry pullback from wokeness, and that the main reason we haven't seen one already is just because game development takes time, and so any response is delayed. For example, Concord began development in 2016, which is the same year Overwatch released to great success, and might explain why people thought another diverse hero shooter was a good idea. So even though anti-woke pushback now seems obvious, the industry hasn't actually had much time to adapt to this yet, when you consider when the games currently releasing might have begun development. And there you go, we discussed wokeness without me saying anything controversial, so no one should be angry, and we can all just move on. If blaming corporations is appealing to some people on the left, and wokeness serves that role for those on the right, what is the explanation for everyone else? I mean, won't someone please think of the poor YouTubers who want to pretend to be apolitical to avoid alienating their audience, but still want to join in farming outrage and act like everything is simple and obvious? Well, don't worry, there's something for them too. Just blame everything on games being bad. Did a game fail? It's because it's bad. Are modern games failing? It's because modern games are bad. Did stock prices go down? That's what happens when games aren't good. And are developers getting laid off? Well, maybe they should try making good games. You know, like they used to. Back in the good games days. That just so happened to be exactly when you were a teenager, but that's just a coincidence. You know, the good games days. When they made Halo 3 and Call of Duty 4, which were so much better than Halo Infinite or Call of Duty 22. I mean, this was the best generation. You know, back when a PlayStation cost an inflation-adjusted $933, and Xboxes used to come with these cool red lights that totally changed the game-playing experience. You know, that same generation where hardware couldn't actually cope with the graphical leap, and so games dropped average frame rates from 60 to 30, which was actually better because it was more cinematic, and also the human eye can't actually see more than 30 frames per second. You know, the same generation that saw almost every gaming genre that wasn't a first or third person shooter die out entirely. The same generation where everything was brown or used a piss filter, and someone kept turning up the bloom to max despite the fact that developers hadn't worked out how to actually implement bloom correctly yet. The same generation that pioneered microtransactions and QuickTime events and trading gameplay for cinematic experiences and fucking motion controls that led to years and years of people telling us that hardcore gaming is dying. Didn't you hear? Hardcore gaming is dying. It can't compete with the casual audience. This is the future. Controllers are too hard to use. Hardcore gaming is dying. Stop being an elitist. Wii Tennis is actually a skill-based game. Hardcore gaming is dying. Waggle your hands, you fucking elitist. This is the future. No, you just wouldn't get it, you kids with your Roblox and V-Bucks. We had Wii Music. We had Wii Music. Oh god. Look at what they did to my poor Miyamoto. No one deserves this. Least of all the man who gave us Mario and Zelda and has spent 44 years in the gaming industry without a single controversy or scandal. Turn it off. Some things are meant to be forgotten. Turn it off! But on the other hand, Halo 3 is better than Halo Infinite. So I guess that means the HD era must have been the best generation. You can't argue with one cherry-picked game being better than another. Oh, wait, yes you can. Once enough time has passed for nostalgia to kick in, every generation is romanticized. They always have been, and always will be, which makes it difficult to separate any change in game quality from nostalgia. Personally, I do think there are ways modern games have declined. For example, so many games, even the best ones, feel overly long now and include too much repetition or filler content. Meanwhile, years of making games more accessible to target wider audiences has made many games too accessible, with a lack of friction and overemphasis on hand-holding hurting experiences. And the endless quest for better graphics and presentation is producing severely diminishing returns while limiting what games can actually depict, as every new element requires numerous expensive assets. There are broad critiques you can make of modern game design, but these are critiques that apply to gaming enthusiasts. Some people might like these modern trends, many won't care that much, and older games had their own problems as well. There are things modern games do better, even if it's not fashionable to admit it. Still, even if we accept that modern games are bad, there are still plenty of signs that making a good game isn't enough. I mean, 2023 was a year full of good games, but there was no noticeable improvements for the industry in layoffs, cancelled games, stock prices, or consumer spending. Other famously strong years also show little divergence from broader trends. Gaming history is also full of great games that flopped. System Shock 2, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, Grim Fandango, Ico, Okami, and Earthbound are just a handful of examples that prove even great games can bomb, and there are plenty more examples both before and since. Also, if making a game good was the only thing which mattered, why is so much money spent on marketing? Even indie games can spend up to 50% of development costs on marketing, and AAA games might spend much more. Marketing doesn't make a game better, and in some ways could be seen as making a game worse by taking financial resources away from the game itself. Yet marketing is still deemed worth it, because an average game with good marketing could easily outsell a good game with average marketing. I mean, Among Us went from hundreds of concurrent players on Steam over its first 2 years to hundreds of thousands in 2020 after a few content creators accidentally made it a viral sensation. There is more that determines success than just quality. Really though, this narrative isn't even about good or bad games. When people say, just make a good game, what they actually mean is just make an amazing game. The examples used to support this narrative aren't actual good games, they are the best of the best. It's always the Baldur's Gate 3s and the Elden Rings that developers just need to replicate, as if this is some easily achievable task anyone can do. I mean, come on developers, just make one of the best games ever made. They always sell well, so just do that and then you can have some of that job security you've always wanted. This feels a bit like telling a struggling athlete to maybe, just run faster. Just make better games. Forget the funding needed, the experience required, or that things can go wrong. Just make game good. And if it's already good, make it more good. Still, what happens if someone does do that? What if someone makes a game that everyone buys, that everyone can't stop talking about, and everyone keeps playing even years after its release? Well, that game would be a success. And all of the time players spend playing that game would come at the cost of playing other games. And so all of the industry's current problems would just continue exactly the same. When people talk about the problems of modern gaming, they love to use indie games as a counterexample. It doesn't matter whether someone's upset about layoffs or failed games, or whether they think the problem is wokeness, corporations, or game design, indie games are somehow always the answer. They are everyone's champions, here to save us from anything the rest of the industry throws our way. So, what about indie games? In 2015, some indie developers started to use the term indie apocalypse to describe the state of the market after the introduction of Steam's Greenlight program. Their concerns can be best illustrated by the data. In 2013, 436 new games released on Steam. By 2015, that number had grown to a massive 2,824, a 550% increase. Many worried that this new competition would prevent indie game development from being a viable career. And that was in 2015. Since then, the number of new games has grown to 18,966 in 2024. And old games are still around and creating even more competition, as indie games aren't invalidated by technological advances or new console generations. Now, Steam has also grown in this period, but not by the 4,250% that new games have, and most of its growth is from overseas markets. So if there was a problem in 2015 from too much competition, that problem is many, many magnitudes bigger today. In fact, despite the number of games on Steam massively going up, the actual number of games grossing over 100,000 in their first year is decreasing. When people talk about indie games being the solution, showing AAA how it's done and profiting from the rest of gaming's decline, they point to the same couple of success stories and then pretend that these are somehow representative of the norm. I mean, haven't you heard? Balatro and Palworld are smash hits, so I guess indie games must be doing great and everything will be fine. Go play Balatro, it's such an underrated gem. In reality though, much like with Baldur's Gate 3 and Elden Ring, these are just the outliers. Each year, indie games do produce a couple of mega hits, but when there are almost 20,000 new titles, that means these represent 1 in 10,000. So, what about the other 9,999? If we return to that 100,000 gross revenue figure that few developers even reach, we can look at what that number actually means. Thanks to revenue calculators, we can estimate that 100,000 in gross revenue leads to about 29,500 in net revenue. So, if you're a solo developer and it took you 5 years of full-time work to make your dream game, you'd be earning $5,900 a year, minus your overheads. Meanwhile, for a team of 5 developers, that would be $1,180 per year, which is about 50 cents an hour. And that's assuming you're one of the lucky winners who makes at least 100,000 gross. The vast majority don't. But hey, Balatro's doing well, so I guess everything's fine. Take that, AAA. Do you know what the single most common piece of advice I hear given to indie developers is these days? Don't. Don't quit your job. Don't make it your career. Don't do it. And if you can't do that, do it as a hobby with no expectation of financial reward. Or get a degree outside of game design and work in a better paid industry for 10 plus years so you build up enough financial security that you can afford to spend a few years working for little to no pay. So, I guess indie games were just in a bubble and now the bubble has burst. Which is funny, because I keep seeing people say that about live service games. And AAA games. And if anyone cared enough to talk about them, they'd say the same about mobile games. So I guess everything was in a bubble. What a strange coincidence. Or maybe this is all just part of the same industry trend. Because it's not an indie problem, or a live service problem, or a AAA problem, it's a gaming problem. For a long time, the industry grew and grew, but growth has limits. Gaming is a colossus. It has spread far and wide, into new demographics, across greater age ranges, and into other countries. But there aren't many more places for it to spread to. And so, in order to keep growing, it needs to increase revenue. And yet, the actual retail price for a new game has been getting lower and lower, all while the costs to create games have been rising. This means games need to sell far more copies, but they're still in competition with every other game, and so they're forced to keep retail prices low, all while making games longer and longer and continuing to push graphics further and further in a desperate attempt to try to attract players. There's a problem with this, however, which is that technological advancements have slowed, meaning old games remain attractive. Once upon a time, gaming went from Grand Theft Auto 1 to Grand Theft Auto 4 in about 10 years. Meanwhile, in the last 10 years, gaming went from Grand Theft Auto 5 to Grand Theft Auto 5, because Grand Theft Auto 5 still looks good and, more importantly, still makes money. The one shining beacon for revenue was microtransactions and live service, and look no further than Grand Theft Auto 5 for proof of this. But while this did increase revenue in select titles, it did this at the cost of an even more limited resource: time. Live service games make more money, but take up much more player time, meaning the market for single-player games decreased as a result. Still, this does show how growth needs to be done now the industry's stagnating. If you can't grow outwards, you need to grow inwards, by cannibalizing the competition. The rewards for the winners of this are substantial. Select live service games make more money in a year than some countries' GDPs. But there can only be so many winners, because players only have so much time, and with that time they gravitate to the same few titles. Maybe the ones their friends already play, or that they've already invested time and money into. And so, just 5 games make up almost 50% of all console playtime, while in 2023, games released in 2023 made up only 6.5% of playtime. Live service games didn't help the industry, they just helped live service games. And yet, a similar trend can be seen in single-player games. In this expansive market, the games that win sell more copies than ever before and can stick around for years, continuing to sell year after year, continuing to be discussed on social media, and continuing to get support from official updates and user-created content. Baldur's Gate 3 had more daily users in 2024 than the year it released, while Hogwarts Legacy hit 30 million units in less than 2 years. Some games are winning bigger than ever, and this doesn't just apply to big budget titles. Eric Baroni, the one-man developer behind Stardew Valley, likely has a net worth in the hundreds of millions, and there's a genuine chance that from Stardew Valley alone, he will one day be a billionaire. Small games can win as big as anything. It's just that every year, there are more and more losers. And again, this exact same trend can be seen in mobile gaming, with the top 3 games making 40% of revenue and 82% of revenue going to titles over 2 years old. So, this is the other key part of this story. At the same time that the market reached the end of its easy growth era, slowing technological advancements have pushed the market more and more towards a winner-take-all model. The winners do now win bigger than ever before, but the number of losers goes up and up, which has exacerbated many of the other trends people have been observing, like high-profile failures, layoffs, and cancelled games. Ultimately, however, this is not a malfunction of the system. It is the system working as intended. Video games are in a race to the bottom for your time and money, and so development costs will stay high and retail prices will stay low as the number of losers will keep increasing, all while the winners cannibalize as much of the competition as they can. Now, I don't really know much about capitalism. I mostly just stick to video games. But I do have to wonder if this isn't the ultimate fate of all free markets in the absence of technological disruption or government intervention. There's something called the Matthew effect, where advantages accumulate and compound, helping winners to keep winning. The result is that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And this can be observed on an individual level just as it can at a market-wide one. I'll let you decide whether that is a good thing or not. Regardless, for video games, This has been a clear trend for many years, and now that industry-wide growth has slowed, its impacts are simply becoming more apparent. And so, part of this isn't the result of anything going wrong, it's more like capitalism going right. And it will continue for the foreseeable future, unless something new and unexpected disrupts the market. As for who's to blame, you really only have two options. Either it's the economic system itself, or it's you and me. Consumers shape the market. We decide where we put our money and how we spend our time. And what we're seeing all around us is the result of those decisions. Thank you for watching. This video's a little bit different to normal, which is mostly because I started two other videos before this that didn't work out, and this video just came about naturally from their ashes. So I hope you found it interesting, but don't worry if you didn't like it. I'll probably be back to more normal stuff next month. Whatever normal means.